Hello, Tim Leonard. How are you?
I'm great, Glenn. It's good to be with you.
Yes, indeed. This is Glenn Loury at the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, talking with Thomas Leonard, who is a lecturer in economics at the Princeton University and has kindly agreed to come on the Glenn Show and talk about his book, Illiberal Reformers, Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era, which Princeton University Press has recently published. So welcome, Tim. Welcome to the Glenn Show.
Glad to be with you, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So let me just frame the discussion a little bit by, if I may, and
Sure.
please correct anything that I say that's not accurate, just describing what I think is going on in the book and why I think it's important. I really do think it's about something important. So this is the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the progressive movement, and this is the founding of the disciplines of economics and sociology, the kind of quantitative social science in American under German university influence coming into existence. This is the Gilded Age. This is massive fortunes being created. This is labor capital relations being worked out in political conflict. This is a kind of critical moment. How are we going to think about combines, big corporate entities, the trusts, the regulation of these things, and so on? So it's a critical moment in American intellectual history. The progressives, Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, I didn't know very much at all, I must confess, as an economist trained in the 1970s about the intellectual climate at this time. And yet I lived on the kind of ruins of it, on the foundation that had been built by it, because the intellectual legacies, 2 or 3 generations would have taken you right back there. And you're making a point about, as I understand it, how ideas about regulation and management, about bringing the sophistication of modern science into the social arena, possessed important figures in this period, and really, in retrospect, leaves them looking. I mean, the word progressive, it's the appropriate historical word, but somehow there's some stuff that's not all that progressive in our contemporary understanding about the ideas that people were affirming then. And these were ideas about very basic things. And I'll stop because I want you to talk about your book, but I'm just trying to frame it. Okay. These were ideas about basic things, like the relationship between the individual and the state. These were ideas about paternalism. These were ideas about the management of natural resources, including the gene pool of the human population. These were ideas about individuals who were fit or who were unfit, about the role of women, about whether or not the African Americans who had been 50 years prior freed from slavery could even then be thought of as potentially fit for equal citizenship or able to actually make themselves competitive in the ideas about social Darwinism, so on and so forth. So all of these ideas, and you're in the midst of it. You're immersed in the contemporary literature. You're sketching the characters of all of these important figures, some of whose names were familiar to me. And so you produced this fine book. Sorry, Tim, I run on. But that only is a reflection of the enthusiasm.
Well, nice talking with you, Glenn.
That's only a reflection of my enthusiasm about the book. Tim, why don't you take it over and tell us what you think the book is about?
Well, you've given it an excellent synopsis. I think a good place to start is with where you started, which is the Industrial Revolution. I think that those of us who are trained as economists, but not necessarily as economic historians, tend to underestimate the sort of economic, political, and social consequences of the so-called Industrial Revolution. It's not too much to say that it represented a kind of inflection point in American history, this moment of sort of profound economic change and dislocation that arose from a number of the trends that you cited. So the railroads allowed the national marketplace to be expanded, and new production technologies allowed goods to be produced more cheaply. Along with industrialization, there was a massive increase in the size of the economy. In the last roughly 3 decades of the 19th century, GDP quintupled, real GDP quintupled. On a per capita basis, living standards doubled. And there was a voracious demand, of course, for labor to work in the factories and the mines and the shops. And that led to an enormous influx of immigration, mostly from Europe, but also from Asia as well. And so there's this kind of, you don't want to say a moment, but there's historically, it's a moment of profound economic change. And the progressives describe a set of intellectuals, some in the academy, some not in the academy, some in public life, some not in public life, some in the university and in public life, who built a set of new vocations to become reformers to address these profound changes wrought by the Industrial Revolution. So they invented these roles that we sort of take for granted now at the time. Roles like, as you say, a university social scientist. Economics was not a university discipline until the progressives made it into one, along with the other social sciences, like sociology, like psychology, like anthropology. They also created, the progressives, this idea of the economist as expert, the expert economist serving in government as an advisor. They invented a whole host of other roles too: social worker, muckraking journalist, a familiar role to any academic, the scholar activist. They invented the American Research University, and most of all, I would say, most importantly for my story, they also created the regulatory state. So these, if nothing else, this band of intellectuals and reformers are important. The institutions they built remain at the center of American civic life today. And in fact, in a very real sense, Glenn, people like you and me owe our very vocations, our existence to them. We live in the world that they made. They made the research university. They created economics and history as academic disciplines. And they created the regulatory state to rein in what they saw as an economic system that was wasteful, inefficient, and unjust. We live in their world.
We're living in their world. Well, that was wonderfully stated. Thanks so much, Tim. But I want, to try to put ideas, the world of ideas, and the world of economic transformation in relationship to one another. I want to talk about, you stress the sort of miraculous character of the U.S. Economic growth and upsurge in the late 19th century, tripling of GDP in a generation and a half. That's an amazing thing. And the growth of cities, industrialization, urbanization, living standards rising, massive population movements, factory work. You say the railroads, transportation, the world gets smaller. One thinks of contemporary analogs. You think of the transformation in China now. You think about the implications of technology and so on. But the world of ideas. The world of ideas in the economic transformation. So the legitimation of a distribution of wealth. Inequality, the enactment of the sort of terms of bargaining between labor and capital, the framework within which the surplus is going to be divided, the recognition of rights to dignity and respect of certain populations. One thinks of the emancipated slaves, of course, I would. But and the role of the state. I mean, I kept thinking about liberty as I was watching these machinations in your book of people's various calculations and plans about intervention and so on. I kept thinking, I mean, I thought about Hayek, to be honest with you. I mean, and not, that, again, may say more about me than anything else, but it made me think, wasn't there a counter argument to all of this arrogant kind of hubristic assertion about what it is that people thought they could accomplish with their calculations?
You would think.
But anyway, yeah. I wanted you to address the issue of critical. Was there a critical coming to this? So these disciplines are being founded, and these roles are being created, scholar activists and the expert and all of this. A sense of, are we a part of legitimating an order, or are we standing outside of it in some kind of critical role? Where's Marx, for example, in this mix of churning ideas? I mean, don't we need Marx precisely at a time when GDP is tripling in a generation and a half and when these huge institutions are being created? And I don't mean to say need him as a Bible or necessarily even as a guide, but need the critical edge of a kind of historical, political, economic kind of view. Do you see what I'm asking you about?
I think I do. One thing we didn't get to in our little setup there was that the original economic progressives, the progressive economists and some of the other social scientists, did their graduate work in Germany. And in Germany, they were exposed to Marxism, but even more so to what you might call a kind of Bismarckism. The men, if you will.
I like that.
Yeah. The men who taught them, people like Schmoller, Gustav Schmoller and Karl Knies and Wagner, were not Marxists. They were sometimes mockingly referred to as socialists of the chair or socialists of the lectern. But what they really were sort of top-down welfare statists who imagined themselves and indeed positioned themselves politically between English, what they disparaged as English economics, laissez-faire if you want, or as they called it, Manchester School economics, on the one hand,
yes,
and as they put it, vulgar Marxism on the other hand. So though their German professors, like the American students who sat at their feet, were sympathetic to the suffering of the working class, but they never imagined themselves as a vanguard intellectually representing the working class workers. And in fact, this is very important for understanding the original progressives' self-conception, how they regarded their role and the function of their ideas in developing institutions. They positioned themselves, just about all of them, as arbiters of a kind of national economic and social good. They weren't apologists or representatives of capital. They had nothing good to say, of course, about the undeserving rich, but neither were they the tribunes of the working poor, right? Their anger, their resentment, their concern was directed, yes, at the undeserving rich, but also at the undeserving poor. They imagined themselves as sort of national arbiters. They didn't think entirely in terms of classes, though they recognized the emerging industrial classes created by this spectacular economic change. They imagined themselves as and spoke about themselves as the representatives of a kind of national good, as society's representatives who were able to adjudicate between the robber barons on the one hand and the rabble on the other, or the working class on the other.
Forgive me, but what gives them the right? I mean, who the hell are they?
They were self-appointed, of course.
Where's democracy in all of this? And again, I think of Hayek. I think of, once you start planning, somebody's got to devise the plan. Nobody elected those people.
Well, that's right. And one of the most interesting parts of the story, Glenn, I think, or at least it was interesting to me, is that, of course, the way that they were going to regulate economic life is through this new creation, the administrative state. There was no administrative state in the Gilded Age. There certainly was economic regulation of economic life, but that took place mostly at the state and local level, and most of the regulation was done by judges and by legislators. The progressives famously were hostile not just to American economic life, but also to American political life. So they imagined the agent of economic and social change to be an administrative state, but first they had to build it. It didn't exist. So the government plays a very interesting role. There's a tension really in their construction, because the chief agency of social reform is going to be this new administrative state that they blueprint and ultimately build by the end of Woodrow Wilson's first term. But it has to be built. So government for them is simultaneously the agent of reform that they're imagining, but it's also the object of reform. They first have to get an administrative state before they can manage this program of planning, investigation, and regulation that's now a commonplace of our economic life today.
Well, it's not such a pretty picture. I'm sitting here listening to you, and again, thank you, because it's all very fascinating. And I'm thinking about James Scott, Seeing Like a State. You know this book that I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. It's right behind me, next to mine.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, then I touched close to home, because I was fascinated from the very first page. I mean, I think he starts out talking about German forestry management, talking about Germany, and about the kind of industrial imposition of planning format over a natural system that had its own logic and its own versatility and its own robustness. You ended up with something that was much more fragile, something that was anyway. I digress. But the administrative state. So now these are all taken for granted beliefs. I mean, we think that planning works. We think that standing up a bureaucracy is the way to solve a problem. And I'm wondering if something hasn't been lost there. But anyway, I think that's my old conservative in me coming back again. That's making me feel insecure as you describe these visionary planners with all of their expertise.
Well, it's important, as you know, Glenn, from reading the book, to understand they didn't just make up this idea of planning. They had a variety of sources. They certainly were arrogant enough to believe that the workers and the citizens would gratefully accept tuition from them because they knew it was best. But they actually used as their model for planning scientific management, or Taylorism, as it's sometimes disparagingly known today. Taylorism was all the rage in the teens, and Taylor was a progressive. He described himself as a progressive. It wouldn't be a term that we'd use naturally today, but his idea basically was, if you put the right people in charge, the applied scientists who know what's best, will increase production so much that labor and capital can stop fighting over how we divide the surplus, because the surplus will be so large. It's an enormously seductive vision. It happens to be wrong, we can say 100 years later, but it was very appealing to the progressives, because instead of seeing sort of labor conflict as endemic to the world, as the product of incorrigible differences, Taylor promised an engineering fix, a technical fix. If we can just get it right, if we can put the planners in charge and get rid of the bosses who are pre-scientific, then we can increase output so much that we won't have to worry about the division.
How does that idea move from the factory floor to the question of public management and policy and bureaucracy? I mean, isn't the public question a different kind of, or is it?
Well, yes, I would say it is, and you would too, I think. But the notion, this very appealing notion that we can use this model of what Taylor called efficiency and make other sorts of organizations, not just factory floors, efficient, was something like a craze in the 1910s. It wasn't just applied to government, it was applied to schools, to the military, to charity, to scientific charities, to all manner of organizations, was this idea that if we use applied science and we let the engineers be in charge rather than the capitalists or the factory floor bosses, that we'll be able to engineer our way towards greater justice and greater efficiency.
What would be another arena in which this belief in the efficacy of applied science would operate, other than the Taylor notion about time, coordination of people's work in a factory or something like that?
Well, I would argue that many of the other progressive reform movements were deeply informed by scientific management. One example that I instance in the book is the municipal reform movement. Remember, if you're going to have an administrative state regulating economy and society, you got to build it. So the municipal reform movement was led, in fact, by some of the same progressive economists like E.R.A. Seligman at Columbia. And the idea here is we've got to get the political hacks and the partisans out of office, and we have to move control from the politicians towards the managers. This is where the city manager comes from, right? The idea of a city manager rather than a mayor, the idea of using public budgeting rather than simply let politicians dispense jobs and tax breaks as they see fit. These are quintessentially progressive reforms, and they also have their sort of intellectual basis in the idea of scientific management. There's no reason why any organization the progressives believed, whether it was government, whether it was a military, whether it was a school, whether it was a university, even the churches, and ultimately, of course, even human heredity, couldn't be better managed in the public interest.
Okay, so this is illiberal, and I gather that's where the illiberal reformers comes from in the title.
Yes.
I mean, a liberal, it seems to me, in not having the preferences of the individual persons be the ultimate determination of what's good, but rather imposing something. And I'm just wondering where that idea comes from, the confidence. What has happened? I mean, and I reveal my ignorance here, ideas about religion. What about community? I mean, I assume that the ethnic, cliques and networks that were operating in these corrupt municipalities also had social capital functions that were of some value in their own account, Anyway,
absolutely.
So I'm just wondering about the climate of ideas that allowed this countercurrent that I feel now, looking back, not to have been effectively expressed at the time.
Well, there certainly was. I mean, one of the great tragedies, I think, of progressivism and in its original incarnation was that it began as a sort of voluntarist movement. The idea was that you could persuade people that certain kinds of reforms were justified. And many of the organizations like the National Consumers League started out as voluntarist. The idea was if you inform consumers about the work conditions under which their, say, clothing was produced, fair trade, to borrow a 21st century term, they'll respond and either boycott or pay more for decently produced goods. So tell them about the sweatshops and the consumers will take care of it. The outcome, though, was that almost all progressives ultimately turned to the state because the state held out the very seductive promise of getting it done faster and getting it done more thoroughgoingly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the subtitle of the book is Race, Eugenics, and American Economics, and I don't think we've really talked very much about any of those things.
Not yet.
So what's up with the race? What's up with the eugenics? And how does that relate to the founding of American economics?
Well, I don't think, Glenn, you can understand American economics in the beginning without understanding a whole set of intellectual influences, Darwinism in particular. It's difficult to understand in retrospect, but the progressives imagined themselves to be scientists. Now, they had a slightly different conception of economic science than what we would recognize today. It was decidedly biological. I mean, in some ways, Charles Darwin was a personal exemplar for them. But Darwinism, Darwin's ideas, or at least the set of Darwin's ideas that they borrowed, was also at the heart of progressive economics. They borrowed the idea of evolution to explain American economic history. They borrowed the idea of competition, adversely selecting rather than beneficially selecting, right? So if you were a social Darwinist and you wanted to defend laissez-faire, you could argue that natural selection, survival of the fittest, produced survivors who were fitter. On the other hand, if you were a progressive, you could say that competition, Darwinian competition, adversely selected, that it selected for inferior workers, for example, and that the whole point of regulation, for example, keeping inferiors out of the country or out of the labor force, was a means of preventing adverse selection. So there's a whole roster of Darwinian ideas that the progressives, as well as their critics, borrow to defend their views of the economy.
I just want to back up for a minute and ask you an economics question on the thing that you've just said about inferior workers, because I find this really very interesting, that one way to advocate for keeping wages high and for benefiting the fit working class is to keep inferior workers out.
Yes.
And the question I want to ask is, I can make no sense of that whatsoever.
No.
From an economics point of view. In other words, I go back to Ricardo. So we're growing wine on land of different quality. How is any welfare advanced by prohibiting growing wine on the bad land? I mean, even if there are various gradations of labor, I don't see how lopping off the bottom, I see how it might be a kind of monopsonistic move to benefit other workers, but I don't see how it raises social welfare.
Right. Well, that's because you did your training in the 70s and not at the turn of the 20th century. It's very important to understand that the marginal productivity theory of wages and indeed of factor pricing is just barely getting off the ground here. So John Bates Clark has written his papers at the very end of the 19th century that claim workers, are, at least in a competitive market, will get paid the value of their marginal product. But if you look at the textbooks right up, through World War I, marginal productivity is kind of presented as one among many different theories of wage determination, right? It's certainly not a majority view. And so nobody, for example, draws a labor supply curve even to take the other side of the labor market until well after the progressive era. And so there's a whole multiplicity of theories of how wages are determined. Yeah. In a world of marginal productivity, it makes no sense. I agree. And what's interesting is that you see we're kind of at a moment before marginal productivity theory sort of becomes established in what we now know as labor economics. Remember, there was no such thing as labor economics. In fact, there wasn't even industrial relations, which was the old name for labor economics, in the 1920s. And in fact, if you do a little short history of your labor economics, you don't have to go back too far. You'll remember this. In the 50s, men like John Dunlop and Clark Kerr, right, Dick Lester at Princeton, all of those leading lights of labor economics, what we call labor economics today, would have denied that the labor market works like the goods market or works like the money market. They would have said it's different because we're talking about people.
This guy Marshall, wasn't there a guy at Texas named Marshall who became Secretary of Labor who was also of that school? But anyway, yeah, I hear you.
So it's natural for us to look at that and say, this is wacky, not just in terms of its racial attitudes, which are so archaic, but in terms of sort of neoclassical economics. But there was no neoclassical economics. That's the important thing.
Okay, so you were saying that to understand modern economics, one has to understand the intellectual climate at this point in time at the turn of the 20th century. And Darwinism, the influence of Darwinism was very profound. What else was going on in the intellectual climate of that time that you think is fundamental in shaping, economics as a discipline?
Well, I think that in addition to the civil engineering scientific management part that we talked about as a basis for reforming all organizations, including government, not just factories. There's Darwinism, and there's also a close cousin of Darwinism, or maybe it's a distant cousin. I'm not certain. Eugenics. Eugenic thought we sometimes lump together with Darwinism, and that's because eugenics is a dirty word still today. That's another anachronistic thing we need to get around in order to understand American intellectual life a century ago. Because we lived after the Holocaust and we now know a lot about the crimes committed in the name of eugenics in the middle of the 20th century. But at the beginning of the 20th century, eugenics was not a radioactive term. In fact, it was a way of signaling your high-mindedness, your concern about racial health, if you like, or hereditary health. The only analog I can find today is like being worried about the climate.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Yeah. So, and that's not because I disbelieve climate science. As best I can tell, the climate scientists have got it right. But the point is that you and I as scholars don't really know the climate models. We don't know it. We don't understand it. So we have to sort of, as thoughtful people, but not as professionals, we have to rely on the experts.
Okay, now I just want to connect the two things because I've been thinking all this time about illiberal, you experts with your hands on the levers of power, where's my Hayek when I need him? And now you're talking about eugenics, and you're saying you have to understand at the time people were just conserving resources, and they understood the human gene pool to be one of the resources to be conserved. Now,
the most important.
Now, what makes that argument wrong, if it's wrong? Let's bracket that question, is it wrong or not, for a moment, and assume that it's wrong. What would make it wrong? Well, you invoke the Holocaust, you invoke Hitler, and, this kind of mass manipulation of people and the extermination of people and awful crimes once we undertake to do this. And the question that I have is, isn't that potential already latent in the very idea of expertly guided, scientifically calibrated management, period? Management of the gene pool now happens to be one application of it. And isn't the illiberality of that expert-driven, getting your hands on the mechanisms of the state in order to make the world a better place, isn't that the alarm bell that should go off in a liberal's mind against that illiberality vindicated by the abuse of eugenics that we finally see in the Third Reich? I mean,
I think it is. So if you were a classical liberal at the time, at the turn of the 20th century or in the first decade or two of the 20th century, you should have been concerned and alarm bells should have been going off. What happened, though, is you might say a kind of piecemeal attack rather than carpet bombing. So today, if you think about a liberal in the 20th century sense of the term, a liberal in the 20th century sense of the term wants to preserve some of the Bill of Rights liberties, but not all. Right? This is how we teach it in the textbooks. We teach the progressive era as dispensing with economic liberties, freedom of contract, property rights, and the like, while preserving the really important liberties, civil liberties, and personal liberties. But I think one of the legacies of this progressive transformation is that we now, whether we're on the right or the left, we now get to choose among which set of liberties are worth preserving. And I think that this is the beginning of a chipping away at the notion that there is this sort of, sacred's not the right word, but inviolable set of liberties, as, for example, the Bill of Rights, which must stand between individuals and the government. That's what the Bill of Rights is. It's a list of individual protections against government depredation. What the progressives said, is in the textbook version, they said, let's just take a couple of them out. Economic liberties don't really belong at the same level as civil liberties do, so we can take those out in the name of the greater good. And one of the things that I hope my book is able to show is that story is incomplete. As you suggest, planners are not content to decide which liberties can go and which liberties can stay. The whole point of eugenics is the eugenics story, I think, is to demonstrate it wasn't just economic liberties that went with this inflection point in history. It was also civil liberties too. So the answer is, I agree. Alarm bells should have been going off. Here's the thing, though, Glenn, just as a historical matter, Walter Lippmann, who began life, by the way, as a progressive, he was one of the founders of the New Republic, which in some ways is representative of a very important strand of progressivism. Yeah. Walter Lippmann, who, by the way, was a very he was a very smart economist and wrote about economic issues for a generation. Yeah. Lippmann said, an American will endure almost any insult except the charge that he is not progressive. and so if you look at, just to pick an example, you look at the 1912 campaign, Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, poor incumbent Taft, and Eugene Debs running as a socialist, right? Every one of those candidates, the conservative, the Bull Mooser, the Democrat Wilson, and the socialist Debs, called themselves progressive. There was going to be change. The question was only, what form would it take? And the progressives, the economists among them, saw their opportunity. Economic crisis represents opportunity. They saw their opportunity, and ultimately they prevailed, which is why we live in their world and why I think it's worth understanding the origins of their ideas and the institutions they built.
You repeat yourself, and it's very much worth saying again, underscoring what you're up to. Now, I was going to comment to the effect that we talk about eugenics in the abstract. I mean, when you read graphically, as I did in your book, what it means for managing the fertility of the feeble-minded and the criminal. And I'm thinking the capacity of these decision makers, these experts, to ascertain, feeble-mindedness, criminality. I mean, these are constructions, and they're And I also read about what I take to be very confused scientific ideas about the relationship between managing the environment and what the implications of that would be for the genetic, content that would be going forward. That I don't understand how it is that changing the environment could actually have a genetic effect across generations. I thought that was a fallacy. I'm not being a biologist, but I'd always thought that was doesn't that have a name, Lamarckianism or something?
Yeah,
like
it's
that?
Lamarckianism, and it's we're getting into the weeds a little bit here, Glenn, but it's very important for understanding reform Darwinism as opposed to conservative or social Darwinism.
Okay, let's not get into the weeds for a minute, because my point was going to be, given the inexactitude of the social measurement on which eugenic type interventions would have been based, including discouraging people from reproducing, the inexactitude of those instruments, that just underscores the kind of troubling character of this illiberal regime that you're describing.
Yeah. Well, what you see here is a combination of arrogance on the one hand, as you say, and naivete on the other hand. And but we have to resist the temptation, I insist, to what's the phrase, the condescension of posterity.
Yeah.
There's a temptation, not just because of the awful things that were done much later in the name of eugenics. There's always a temptation to look backwards and condescend to those who came before us because we know better now.
Okay, so then I have to ask you. I mean, excuse me for interrupting. I just have to ask you because you're sitting right there in Princeton, and Woodrow Wilson is one of these people. So,
I would say that this is also a line from the end of the book. That the history of bad ideas is just as interesting and important as the history of good ideas, precisely because any historically important bad idea, and eugenics counts as one, and certainly race science counts as one, any historically important bad idea was thought by many people at the time to be a good idea. And so we do a disservice to these people if we say, well, it was just a bunch of cranks, proto-fascists, and it was a pseudoscience. That's simply not correct. That may be our judgment from 100 years on. But at the time, remember, these are the best and the brightest. I certainly in their own minds. And so it's very important to remember, I think, if you want a lesson, that 100 years from now, two academics like you and I will be looking backwards at, say, early 21st century economics or early 21st century politics and saying, what in the world could they have been thinking? It's not only offensive, how could they have seen it as scientific?
Yeah. I want to make a comment here because I agree. I mean, there is this pointed question about what do you do with a Woodrow Wilson? What do you do with a Calvin Coolidge, for that matter, in the 21st century, right, as the legacy of a university is being dealt with? But you say you want bad ideas, okay? So now there's an inference problem because people have ideas about how the world works, and then they have values, which are something for which I feel like I should hold them responsible. I mean, so if I thought a person were cruel, if I thought they were willfully willing to harm others, if I thought they were masochistic, I would judge them, regardless of what the tenor of the time was. I mean, I would, it's like, here's how I'm thinking about it. A person has their information, which is whatever the state of scientific knowledge is at a point in time, which in retrospect, we oughtn't judge them for not being as smart as we are now. But they also have their values. And when I observe their behavior, I'm seeing the outcome of both of those things playing out. Yes. And I'm trying. So you take notes on the state of Virginia. I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson.
Sure.
Okay. So he was a man of his time. He certainly was a scientist. He was a man of ideas. He was a very modern man of his time. One of the leading intellectuals on the planet of his time. On the other hand, and so when I read, on the other hand, he's a slave owner.
On the other hand, he was a slave owner
and so on. So now we have in the 21st century to construct a narrative about this, knowing what we know. We can't blame him for not being the race scientist or the anti-race scientist that we would be today. We can't blame him for that. Mm-hmm. But can we blame him for fathering children with a slave and et cetera, et cetera? Can we blame him for that? So that it seems to me that that's kind of the problem that's unresolved by the observation that you just made.
I agree. So let's get into it. With respect to Woodrow Wilson, as you know, a bunch of students occupied the president of Princeton's office and demanded that Wilson's name be scrubbed from the public policy school, which is named for him, and also from one of the colleges, one of the residential colleges, which is also named for him. As it turns out, that's not going to happen. But the charge was, the students said Wilson was a racist. And it struck me at the time that was accurate but incomplete, right? It is correct to say, just as a historical assertion, that the vast majority of Americans, certainly white Americans in the progressive era, were racist. But I think it's important to make a distinction between racism as a kind of personal, individual prejudice, of which there are many varieties, and racism, on the other hand, as enforced using the coercive power of the state. So, for example, to continue with Wilson, since you brought Woodrow Wilson up, Wilson certainly was a racist. He told darky jokes in the White House, and he screened offensive movies and all the rest, Birth of a Nation. But to me, that's all second order compared with what is the more serious offense, which is he allowed McAdoo and another of his henchmen to resegregate the federal workforce. That's a very different thing, right? To say that somebody's a racist is to make a serious charge.
Yeah.
To say that they resegregated the federal workforce is to make a vastly more serious charge, and there's a difference.
Point taken.
I would distinguish between being a racist and joining a lynch mob. I would distinguish between having sort of not so well thought out attitudes about other peoples of various kinds that sees them as inferior, and using the coercive power of the state to restrict immigration based on race or nationality. So I don't think being sophisticated about the differences between racial attitudes, say, in our time and theirs, requires us to completely avoid making moral judgment. The point of history is in fact, I think, to help us distinguish, in some sense, between what are the more serious offenses, like, for example, resegregating the federal workforce, and sort of having unpleasant attitudes which were widely held.
Well, it sounds like you're saying the students are well-grounded, but to the extent that they made a generic charge of racism, they weren't being specific enough about Wilson.
They didn't get to the worst of it. I'm proud of them. They knew enough history to understand that Wilson was a racist, and that maybe the institution they were attending shouldn't be giving him the place of honor that he currently had. What I wish they'd pointed out is what Wilson did with his racism.
I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the university has nevertheless decided that it will not expunge Wilson's name from the school or the dorm, the living quarters.
That's right. What's happening is they're actually taking down a mural of Wilson that's in Wilson College, and I don't have a particular position on.
Yeah,
on
I'm not asking you to
do.
Yeah.
I do think that it's a separate question. I'm competent to evaluate Wilson's historical legacy. Whether a private institution should be allowed to give a place of honor to an ambiguous character is a separate thing.
So now, where do the descendants of the slaves fit in this picture of progressivism? Are they an indigestible mass of fatally flawed humanity that somehow the country is confronting this profound problem of how to digest? Or are they a downtrodden, yeoman's class of peasants who've been dispossessed and set adrift?
Well, the freedmen and their descendants are kind of a minor figure for the progressives, and the reason is that the progressives were primarily concerned with economic competition. They were focused first and foremost on labor market competition by a variety of people, defectives, the feeble-minded, Jews, Catholics, and Orthodox Christians from Europe, the Yellow Peril, of course. And the reason that they were focused on those groups more than the traditionally vilified African Americans is that Black people were only beginning to escape the Jim Crow South in the Progressive era. The Great Northern Migration was just getting underway, and Black workers were not yet at least the same threat economically than were the other despised groups.
Because it was presumed that they were going to stay in the South and in the rural.
Right. Yeah. They were that Jim Crow would persist, and Black folks would be condemned to be sharecroppers and domestics as they currently were, and they weren't yet a threat. Now, of course, they would later be, but that's a story for another book. That happens after the Progressive era. When the Progressives did write about African Americans, and it is important to understand when they spoke of race, they used it in a very broad sense, not just black, white, yellow, red, brown, which was an established sort of convention, but also, the Irish race or the Hebrew race. Or the so-called Slavic race. They used the term in a very elastic sense. But when they did talk about African Americans, like everyone else who purported to do race science, they had a profoundly contemptuous attitudes, and they, like everybody else, put Black Americans at the bottom of their pyramids of human hierarchy.
Amongst what we would call now the white races, I was struck by the extent to which Jews were vilified, and often being in your characterizations amongst those enumerated as unfit, and their intelligence. And again, one looks at the history of American intellectual life in the 20th century and wonders, how wrong can you get? Can you get any more wrong than that?
they were wrong early and often, but that's partly, Glenn. That's partly a function of the fact that just a matter of periodizing the great sort of Jewish migration out of Europe, especially, happened towards the end of the 19th century and in the first decade of the 20th century. And so it was still early days for Jewish immigrants. They were still trapped in the tenements and working in garment factories and had not yet made their way into American intellectual life, as they would shortly do.
I know, but my point is, in retrospect, we can see that the biologizing of their environmental circumstances as new immigrants living in tenements and working in the garment industry was a mistake.
Profoundly wrong, and embarrassingly so for someone like John R. Commons. Commons was looking for work, and he got a job with McKinley's Industrial Commission at the turn of the century, 1899. And he and his fellow investigators went around to various tenement factories. And what Commons objected to about the Jews is that they couldn't be organized. Right, they were reluctant to join unions, which Commons at the time saw as a part of a solution to the labor question. He said that Jews join when it's profitable, and they won't join when they see it as unprofitable, and therefore they're bad for labor organization. This is in Commons's book "Races and Immigrants" in 1907, and months after Commons made this, fairly typical anti-Semitic remark, Jews started taking leadership positions in unions and became very active in worker organizations, making Commons look not just an anti-Semite, but also look pretty foolish.
All right, let me ask you a question. We have this history of economics at the turn of the 20th century. And we see it being influenced by the current of ideas at the time, Darwinism, management, scientific policy, etc. Here we are in the 21st century. Suppose somebody, we're both economists, wants to run a wage regression, and they're comparing blacks to white Americans in the labor market today. Mm-hmm. And they've got a very good measure of cognitive ability, mm-hmm. IQ. And they put it on the right-hand side of their wage regression, and then they say, and as you know, these papers have been written, and then they then say, look, what would have appeared to be 75 cents on the dollar is really 93 cents on the dollar once you've controlled for IQ. Are they rightly, these labor economists who would run that regression, and that is to say, explain away black-white wage differences in America today by reference to the lower average IQ of the black worker today as measured by whatever instruments are available, the intellectual heirs of the progressive era eugenicists who had simple-minded, wrong ideas about the relationship between race, ability, and social outcomes. Is one legacy of the wrongful illiberal intellectual orientation of the founders of modern quantitative social measurement, the contemporary practice of using IQ to explain away racial differences. I ask you, Tim, what do you think about that?
So am I answering with my economist hat on or my history hat on?
You can use whatever hat fits.
All right, I'll see if I can get them both on.
There you go.
Yeah. I think in some way, yes, they are the legatees of that way of thinking in two senses. In one sense, there's this kind of ongoing hope that economics and the other social sciences will be scientific enough that we can really get to the bottom, in this sense, using IQ as a kind of proxy for marginal productivity, of economic and social processes. This notion that if we just have good enough instruments, if our measurement can be precise enough, rich enough, granular enough, then we really can do social science. So in that sense, they're very much the legatees, this kind of methodological naivete. The other sense in which I would say they're the descendants is a continuing willingness to think about workers, in this case, as members of groups. That is, starting with the group, say, African Americans or white people, and using those as units of analysis rather than starting with individuals. I think that, too, is partly a progressive era legacy. This is something we haven't talked about yet because I don't want to get too far in the weeds. But another thing that we owe to the progressives, at least in this country, other countries had different versions, is this idea of seeing society as an organism, or of seeing aggregates as individuals, as entities. And this is indeed part of the illiberal turn, is to think about, we think about when we teach undergraduates, we talk about maximizing lifetime utility of an individual, right? And sometimes you can have negative utility when you're investing in your human capital as a young person, because later in life you're going to have higher wages as a result of a successful investment. And nobody cares if your utility is negative while you're in medical school, because you're going to have a higher wage as a result later in life. However, if we make the mistake of transporting that maximization, that objective function, into a welfare function, not an individual, but treating society as an individual, right? Where in a utilitarian way, we simply maximize everybody's individual utilities additively, we add them up, and then we maximize welfare. There's the problem noted by many before me that some of those utilities can be negative while still socially maximizing. And I think, too, part of the illiberal turn is not just sort of a disregard for Bill of Rights liberties, your Hayekian worry. It's also the invention, as I put it in the book, of a kind of American-style holism. It wasn't going to be Marxian. It wasn't going to be European in other collectivist ways. But there is this sense of the social whole and of the experts as the representatives of that social whole, if you like, the agents of the social organism, that I think is also intellectually, as an idea, an important progressive legacy too.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think we might want to call it a day. I just want to bring to your attention, if you haven't seen it, this book by Rogers Brubaker, the sociologist at UCLA, called Ethnicity Without Groups. You know the book?
I know of it. I haven't read it.
Collection of essays, but I mean, very much on this, making you, I mean, this is what I thought as you were talking, because we are so immersed in this that we now take it for granted. It's like a fish in water. I don't think that I've made a move when I start using these aggregates. It's just a natural way of thinking about society. But in fact, I have made a move. I've constructed something when I've done it. And unless I'm critically aware, when we attribute things to race and ethnicity and we talk about it in these kinds of terms, unless I'm critically aware of the fact that that's an actual imposition on reality of my conceptual frame, I can make mistakes, including profound moral mistakes.
Yes.
So,
Indeed. It's a very important lesson, Glenn, and it's hard for all of us to avoid those categories. We might call it the Ricardian vice, right? This desire to do something scientific, to modeling, for example, requires that we strip things down. We can't simply have the map be identical to the territory, right?
Yeah.
But when we strip things down, we have to be very careful about our categories, and we have to remember, as a good classical liberal would, that the correct unit of account is the individual.
Now, I just have to make another point. This is an afterward, but as you were talking, I was thinking about representative agent, Lucas-style macro theory, and unemployment. Okay? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about arguments about intertemporal substitution of leisure, and we're in an equilibrium with certain levels of unemployment. And you know what was in my mind? Who the fuck doesn't have a job? Okay, that's an actual person. That's not like one state being contemplated by somebody maximizing the expected value of something. That's an actual person.
It is. And I think Coase called it blackboard economics, the fallacies of blackboard economics. And I'm not trying to make some sort of grand methodological indictment here. I'm just connecting your question, the IQ question, to my story, because I do think that I don't want to call it lazy. It's part of the legacy that we've inherited intellectually, and we have to be on our guard.
Tim, thanks. Okay, so Thomas Leonard of Princeton University. His book is Illiberal Reformers, Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era. And we are grateful to you for coming on the Glenn Show, Tom. Tim! Thanks very much.
So good to talk to you, Glenn.
Yeah. So we'll sign off.